Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so kindly for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Car Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple. And tonight I'm really glad to welcome Adam Greenfield for a celebration of his book, Lifehouse, Taking Care of Ourselves in a World on Fire. Let's give a hand for Adam. You've come a long way to be here at Green Apple, so we're really glad to have you. Thank you, Adam. He is joined tonight by Allison Area. Let's give a hand for Allison as well. Thank you. This is special. We're glad to have both of you here. Thank you for joining us here in person and online. Hello, online audience. I'm waving to the camera. If you can't see, then I'm waving to a camera. We are broadcasting from San Francisco, California. We open each of our events with a land acknowledgement. We are operating on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land, and we think that acknowledgement requires action, and so we encourage you to donate either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. We have details specifically about the Ramaytush Ohlone Land Trust at the back desk here if you're interested in how to participate in this project of repatriation. Very brief business before we get into the heart of the matter. Now's a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. Is picture taking okay?
Yeah.
I'm putting you on the spot a little bit.
Yeah, I don't mind.
Picture taking is okay. They do not mind. Just don't take a call. That would not be cool. Please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event that you're currently attending. The restroom is behind me. It is available after the event, not during the event for obvious reasons. If you need to know how to get there, do let me know and I will gladly help you. We have copies of two of Adam's titles at the front register, including his most recent one. At the front register, you can find them there. If you've been here before, you've certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support the writers who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part.
Do you want to say the thing about the bookshop in Oakland?
Thank you so much. I asked for a reminder and I got it. So Adam very graciously offered to donate a portion of the proceeds from sales of Lifehouse, and let's do Radical Technologies too, tonight, to East Bay Booksellers in Oakland, which, if you know, they had a massive fire last week and the store is a total loss. And they're like my neighborhood bookstore. I live on that block. So as a bookseller and as their neighbor and friend, it feels like really personal and really devastating. And if you're book people, it's probably pretty devastating too. So we're going to donate 10% of any of Adam's titles that you purchased tonight from them. And I'll plug this. I'll try and be very brief. But we're also having a benefit show for them on August 18th. It's not up yet. It's not online. We're all putting it together pretty quickly at Gilman Brewing in Berkeley, where we'll be doing much more stuff to them. We have a good lineup of people who are reading and a big raffle where you can win prizes. Just trying to get them back on their feet. They're good people. So yeah.
Sorry, what was the name of the store again?
East Bay Booksellers on College Avenue. Yeah. They do good work. So yeah, thank you, Adam. It's really generous, and we appreciate you folks. If you have any questions about it, I will gladly tell you. Okay. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two folks who are joining us tonight. First, Allison Area is the editorial director of MIT Technology Review. She was previously editorial director for the urban planning and policy think tank SPUR, which you might know as the San Francisco Bay Area Planning and Urban Research Association. From 2007 to 2020, she wrote a regular column about architecture, design, cities, and technology for the opinion section of the New York Times. She was editor-in-chief and founding senior editor of Well magazine from 2000 to 2007. Let's give one more hand for Allison Area. And last but most certainly not least, Adam Greenfield has spent the past quarter century thinking and working at the place where technology, design, and politics intersect. Bear with me. We got it. His books include the best-selling Radical Technologies, The Design of Everyday Life, Against the Smart City, and Everywhere, The Dawning of Ubiquitous Computing. His latest book, Lifehouse, is the reason you're here tonight. Let's give one more hand for Adam Greenfield.
Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be back here in San Francisco. This used to be, the spot that we're sitting in right now used to be my video store when I lived in the neighborhood. So I have walked these aisles many times. It is a little short of surreal to be back in this particular patch of the earth. And curious too, to be in such a wonderful company, in such a wonderful mood, with a not unheavy book that has a not unheavy message. The message of that book is that we're in for hard times. I mean, those of us who are not already dealing with the unfolding disaster that is late capitalism, that is the grounding condition of our lives. Everyday life is already an emergency for so very many of us. What I mean to say is that it is going to be that way for all of us, and in ways that we haven't even begun to contemplate. So I'm not interested in belaboring that. I'm not interested in kind of, I mean, I think we should sit with it. I think we should reflect upon what that means. But I don't want to dwell on it over much. What I'm really, really interested in is what do we do in response to that set of conditions? And it will not surprise you, people being as creative as they are and having such a broad diversity of perspectives and viewpoints as they do, that we've come up with, any number of ways that as we begin to recognize the terrible straits that we're in, and we begin to incorporate that recognition into our lives, we find different ways of approaching that catastrophe as it unfolds. We find different ways of responding to it. So I'd like to read you a little passage now from the very beginning of the chapter that's called Beyond Hope. And maybe we'll get into why it's called Beyond Hope a little bit later on. And so we find ourselves at a moment of decision. What can we do now to make our way through the terrifying set of conditions we've inherited? What choices are available to us? We can buy less, and that more locally, in the hope that in aggregating and responding to our purchase signals, the market will commit itself permanently and worldwide to a low-carbon production pathway. We can vote in the hope of electing legislatures and governments committed to real climate action and able to see their policies enacted as binding law. We can protest in the hope that legislators will note and heed the will of their constituents, and that governments and transnational bodies can be pushed toward a more aggressive defense of the planet, whether they were elected or not. We can engage in civil disobedience in the hope that we can convince enough of our fellow citizens of the lateness of the hour that they too will be motivated to do something. We can engage in the sabotage of extractive industries in the hope that their calculus of return on investment can be shifted, and that shareholders will tire of plundering the earth for so little in the way of gain. We can work toward the revolutionary seizure of power in the hope that we will succeed in time to take meaningful action on climate, and that our success will inspire other would-be insurgents to undertake and accomplish the same thing everywhere. We can entrust our fate to technical means in the hope that someone somewhere will invent a way of safely decarbonizing the atmosphere, or reflecting the sun's heat back to space, or stabilizing the ice sheets where they are, or really all of that. Each of us is free to commit to any of these courses of action, or, at the risk of some incoherence, even all of them at once. They're all based on a self-consistent theory of change of one sort or another. But despite their superficial differences, all of these strategies share some deep qualities in common. They are all indirect. They leave you moored in your life, standing by, doing nothing to develop your own capacities. They act with delayed effect. However long they take to work, we can be reasonably sure that it is not soon enough. They are wildly contingent on the coordinated efforts of others, depending on the energy, conviction, and incorruptibility of human beings beyond our reach or ability to influence, and their capacity in turn to cooperate with one another at scale. Finally, there's no guarantee that any of these methods will work, or even produce any measurable results at all. You could invest every iota of your life energy in any of these strategies for change for the rest of your days on Earth, and move the needle on climate not at all. This leaves us with one final possibility. We can act directly immediately, locally, without waiting for the state or any other institution to undertake our defense. What might that look like? In her wonderful social history of squatting on New York's Lower East Side, Hours to Lose, Amy Starocheski tells the story of the electricity-generating stationary bicycle set up on the sidewalk outside C-Squat on Avenue C, which supplied power to a bank of phone chargers during the extended outages that followed Superstorm Sandy. The entire community gathered around the chargers, at first simply to top up their phones, but later simply because that's where the people were. Over these days and weeks, the sidewalk in front of C-Squat was the most obvious place for people experiencing a sharp, sudden disruption of their way of life to seek out useful information, the comfort of fellowship, and vital material support. Here in Microcosm is a model for the kind of community infrastructure we will need to see us through the long emergency. When the grid goes down, or the water from the pipes isn't safe to drink, there ought to be a place close at hand where we can attend to these material needs. That is also a place where we might seek the strength, insight, and reassurance of others in the same straits. As the unfolding reality of Earth system collapse increasingly intersects with the organized abandonment of our communities, and the complex systems we rely upon for the maintenance of everyday life prove to be far more fragile and contingent than we'd ever understood them to be, many of us will have more and more need of settings like this. What I believe our troubled times now ask of us is that we be more conscious and purposive about creating these places in our communities, each one provisioned against the hour of maximum need and linked with others in a loose confederal network. I call them lifehouses. The fundamental idea of the Lifehouse is that there should be a place in every 3 or 4 city block radius where you can charge your phone when the power's down everywhere else, draw drinking water when the supply from the mains is for whatever reason untrustworthy, gather with your neighbors to discuss matters of common concern, organize reliable childcare, borrow tools that doesn't make sense for any one household to own individually, and so on, and that these can and should be one and the same place. As a foundation for collective resourcefulness, the Lifehouse is a practical implementation of the values we've spent this book exploring. There's a kind of positive externality that emerges from organizing things in this way as well. As we've seen, one of the problems that always vexes those of us that believe in the assembly and similar deeply participatory ways of managing our communities is that these types of deliberation are often a hard sell. Most of us are exhausted, for starters. Our lives already hem us in with obligations and prior commitments, situations that require our presence and undivided attention. We may not always have the energy or the wherewithal to travel very far to participate, even if we're convinced in the abstract of the value of doing so. If the place of assembly is right in our immediate neighborhood, though, and we happen to be going there anyway to charge a phone, pick up the kids, return a borrowed dehumidifier, or simply seek shelter from the heat, then the odds that any one of us will get meaningfully involved in the stewardship of collective services increases considerably. Just like the phone chargers on the table outside C-Squat, think of the infrastructural provisions as the killer app, the compelling proposition that pulls people into the Lifehouse. But the deep value is in the other voices that we encounter there. That is the proposition. Let's have at it. Let's tear into it.
Can I give you some softballs and some hardballs?
Yeah, hardballs first.
Hardballs first?
Sure, why not?
Okay. All right, let's get into it. So I'm going to give you an example. I live in Glen Park. It's a very neighborhood. I've lived there for 20 years. So when we moved in, we had a very elderly neighbor who had always lived alone, and everyone on our street really hated him because he is the kind of guy who calls the ticket person when you're an inch into their driveway because he was retired. And, but my husband, who's an animal whisperer, an old person whisperer, just really took to him, and we would start bringing dinner over to him 3 or 4 times a week, and my husband would fix all the stuff in his house, and he would get gifts for our daughter, and somehow by reaching out, we had this relationship with him despite everyone else in the neighborhood being oh, that guy. I bring this up because I realize this is making me sound like I'm so great, my neighbors were so bad. That's not my intent. It's like, if you have the impulse, which it's clear that you do and people in this room do, to do these things, what happens when other people in the neighborhood, in the community, don't? Or they're like, I'm going to take care of these 10 people that I like, but I'm not interested in the larger group. This seems to me something that would occur naturally in this concept of attention, of like, you've got a smaller group because you're local, but what's your kind of thought about how do you have a Lifehouse when only 20% of people want it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it is, in fact, something that we also deal with in our neighborhood where, like my partner volunteers for a food hub. And, it is very much the case, as you suggest, that a small minority of people in the neighborhood feel like it's incumbent upon them somehow to care for everybody else. And then other people are sort of happy to take advantage of that. I think ultimately it's a question of culture. I think our culture teaches us and offers us any number of examples of what it looks like to be atomized and what it looks like to be cut off from one another and what it feels like to be severed from the other people around us in most meaningful ways. And I'm always reminded, though, that we learn much of what it is, to comport ourselves. We learn through mimesis. We learn through imitation. We learn through seeing the things that are modeled to us and things that we see around us. And there's this kind of vicious cycle in which a culture that ultimately is sort of compartmentalized and capsulized and doesn't care if we retreat to our houses and never interact with one another in any meaningful way. We learn that and we model it to others. I don't actually think it takes very much, and I have some empirical reason to believe this. This isn't just a lovely feeling. It's something that I've seen with my own eyes. I don't think it actually takes all that much to model a very different way of being, to model a way that, again, doesn't rely so much on personal qualities of compassion, but relies on an ethos of care, which is distributed widely in the community and which becomes something that people call one another to live up to. It's something that's enunciated, it's something that is made explicit, and ultimately over time it becomes part of the fabric of the way in which we interact with one another. And then all of a sudden everything flips over. It's like the whole state reverses, and what becomes unusual is for people to withdraw from that. In the case of Occupy Sandy, which I spend a lot of time talking about in the book, when people were brought into the effort, and we'll spend a little bit of time describing what that effort was if you're unfamiliar with it, they might have started off, their initial interaction might have been as a recipient of aid in some way, but soon enough, they almost became infected by the ethos around them. And there was such an incredible feeling of empowerment and passion and purpose that it became the thing to do to take care of other people. And then that propagated. So the people...
But for a time.
Yes. And
so you do talk in your book about this transition from emergency action, like Sandy, COVID, take your pick, to a more sustained effort. And I'm wondering if maybe you could tell us some of I know that there's some examples of your book of more sustained attempts at this, and maybe it'd be great for you to describe a couple of of those to show kind of how you can.
Sure.
Hopefully we all have the impulse, no matter our political leanings or whatever, to help if there's distress right in front of us.
Sure.
But then what happens when...
Let me back up just a little bit and explain for people who might not be familiar with it what mutual aid is, because I think that is an important part of the context of this question. Mutual aid is bottom-up, self-organized, community-based relief, repair, recovery in times of crisis. The times of crisis might be like when a hurricane or a tornado comes and lands on your house. It might be when wildfires, make the air unsafe to breathe. It might be something that rises out of the climate crisis. It might be for other reasons. It might even be individual. I mean, we see all the time people saying, well, I'm falling on really hard times and I'm up against rent and I really need to activate the community in my aid. the really critical thing that distinguishes mutual aid from other efforts that you might be familiar with is that it's not charity, right? And it's distinguished from charity by its values. There's never an inscription in mutual aid of the savior and the saved. There's never, the idea that I'm coming along to help you. It is a peer-to-peer relationship between people who see one another as respected mutuals and equals. And that actually transforms the relationship. It is very much the case that this mode of self-defense remains available to us in moments of crisis. It's almost, I'm almost moved to say that it's one of the instinctual things that people do when some acute crisis befalls them. We take care of one another. It's what our communities do. But the point you raise, and it's an excellent one, it's something that I try to address, and I'm not certain that we've really gotten very far with it, is what happens when the crisis is permanent. It's easy to sustain this kind of effort over the days and weeks that follow a storm, when the power is out, when the transportation and communication networks are down, when there really is, when the air of the city is suffused with this sense of imminent threat and imminent danger. It's easy to kind of reproduce that almost endocrine feeling of urgency. As the days drag on, what we find is that immediate level of inspiration begins to fade away, and something else has to step in at that point. My argument is that we see from examples like the Greek solidarity networks that sustained the entire nation of Greece when their economy collapsed following the 2011, a crisis so big there that they merely call it the crisis with a capital C. That went on for years, and the solidarity kitchens and the solidarity clinics and pharmacies were able to sustain people because by that point there was nothing else available to them. And I think when confronted with the choice between helping to sustain an effort which is keeping you alive and not doing anything at all, then it becomes very, very easy to sustain that effort. But I think we really, really need to investigate further. The condition of the permanent emergency is one that demands entirely new emotional, affective, psychic responses from us, as well as material and political and social ones. And I think that unfortunately we're going to find out what it takes, whether we want to or not. I don't think that it is going to be a thing that we have a choice about. I think that ultimately the systems that sustain us will have to come through our own efforts, because I do not believe they'll be forthcoming from any other quadrant.
We talked a bit about this earlier, but mutual aid societies have actually been around quite a long time, since the 18th century, and seem to have more staying power in some places and cultures than others. And I'm wondering if you can just speak to a little bit of, through your research, which ones emerged as good models and what did they have that made them so?
I think the fascinating thing is, as you point out, this is just sort of the way that we've always done things. I mean, mutual aid is, for example, how most immigrant communities sustain themselves. They pool their resources. They have, rotating credit associations that are not, regulated by the state or by the market other than, internally. Kropotkin famously in 1905, published a book called Mutual Aid, which was a very painstaking documentation of the way in which traditional societies have always organized commons. Eleanor Ostrom won her Nobel Prize in economics, documenting the ways in which people negotiated the stewardship of common poor resources. These instincts are right there available to us alongside what is more often marketed to us as the natural response to disaster, which is the red in tooth and claw war of all against all, the Mad Max scenario. The recourse to cooperation is so recently a part of the cultures that so many of us came from. It's right beneath the surface. It's available to us in maybe even our parents' stories or our grandparents' stories. It's right there in our oral cultures. It's right there, in our cultural documentation, in the stories and the books and the films that we've made about where we came from. It's not far away, and it survives in some really, really vibrant and important forms. What I worry about is that in terms of the ability of these systems to sustain us, they have become associated with the way that poor people do things. They've become associated with the experience of poverty. And our culture so looks down its nose on things that are associated in any way with the reality of poverty, that it's almost like, well, yeah, I don't want to get any of that on me. People have a real built-in resistance to some of these things. And I think it's a question of more of us getting outside our comfort zone, learning to get over that sort of unconscious classism that we've learned to reproduce, and accepting that these pre-capitalist or pre-postmodern ways of doing things have an enormous amount of force. They continue to work, they continue to sustain people, and they're available to us too.
The cynic in me sees conservative government saying, this is awesome because then we don't have to pay for any of this stuff.
Yeah, that's right. No, that is, there is an uncomfortable,
The unholy alliance, perhaps.
there's an uncomfortable similarity between so many of these things. So I live in the UK, and up until very recently, up until about a month ago, for 14 years we had a conservative government. We had a Tory government, and that government was dedicated to a policy that they called austerity. So they wanted to lower taxes. They wanted to not fund anything in the public sphere. They wanted to withdraw from the maintenance of the public space, the public realm, public life in general, with the predictable consequences. David Cameron, one of the prime ministers, the first prime minister of the kind of run of terrible conservative prime ministers, and as it turns out, far from the worst. They got kind of successfully worse and worse and worse, sort of unreally. He had this idea called the big society. And the idea was not a million miles away from mutual aid. It didn't have the liberatory values. It didn't have the same framing. It didn't have the end or the goal, really, of empowering people. But it was essentially this. It was like, you take on the burden of stewarding your community because we're not going to touch it. And I think that there's actually an opportunity there. I think, weirdly enough, and I don't expect this to be agreed to by everybody who's involved in mutual aid, because most of them come from politically radical backgrounds. But I think that there is a small c conservatism to some of these ideas, weirdly enough. Like I say, they do come out of traditional life ways, and they do come out of our older experiences. I think a lot of them are just, frankly, common sense. I think if you can use that alignment to enlist people to these sorts of efforts, to these sorts of initiatives, kind of sneak in under their radar, and then spring on them the idea that they're doing something fundamentally and profoundly radical at the same time. I think that there's something to that. The big society, as it turns out, was words. I mean, there was never anything behind it. It never amounted to anything much. But I think that we always have to be alive to the co-optation of these movements and efforts, not merely from politicians on the right, but politicians of all sorts. It's ultimately not about political parties. It's ultimately about communities of people acting in their own defense, on their own behalf, under the lights of their own judgment and their own perception of the world. Again, I think it's sort of a cultural matter. I think that we in Occupy Sandy were always alert to the possibility of some politician coming down to the church where we had organized our relief effort and doing a quick pop-up interview, for the TV news and taking credit for all of it. And that would not have been welcome in that environment at all.
So another example. Around the 2009 recession, there emerged this idea of the sharing economy, which really kind of took off in large part because people didn't have an option. Like, I don't have a job, so I'm going to have a urban farm, or I'm going to make jam and trade it. If you do this, I'll make your website, things like that. People were knitting, all these very old-fashioned things, to your point. Though I think that movement, in large part, ended up being a sort of white middle to upper middle class movement in many ways, of people who were doing these things less out of necessity than with a certain cash. It was like, people who moved to upstate New York and, I'm gonna live off the land. Like, there's sort of romanticism to it.
Okay.
So I wrote about this a lot. It seemed like I'm getting cynical about it now, but at the time, it felt like a very positive thing. People were rediscovering how to actually make things and do things and know where their food was coming from. And, the slow food movement was also really peaking at this point. I wrote about it for the Times, saying it was really so old-fashioned as to be avant-garde. But it was very much referring back to even as far back as like pioneer days when you had to know how to do this stuff, or hippie communes where everyone gathered together. You had to make things and share resources because there were no other options.
Sure.
But then something interesting started happening. These ideas became sort of appealing to entrepreneurs who saw sharing as kind of a great way to frame business propositions, and then we got Uber and we got ThreadUp and we got Airbnb, which were presented at the outset as sharing economies, their sole purpose, so that the people engaged in them could make, it was like a gig, a gig in a good way. Like, this is a great thing for you to make extra money and rent out your room. And then, of course, it drifted further and further away from sharing into pure profit motive, which is another way I see this going, of like this relentless urge to kind of monetize even the old-fashioned or purist things.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that's a reality that we always have to be guarding ourselves against. I think that, I should confess from the outset that the way of doing things that we're talking about here asks a lot of people. It is, full on. And people, I think, when offered a choice between that and a shrink-wrapped, sort of delivered to your door experience, I think that it wouldn't be for me, but I'm not going to judge anybody for opting for, the shrink-wrapped version over the really nitty-gritty self-produced version. I will always remember something I learned once in Baltimore. A friend of mine who's an architect there and an architectural instructor had taken me on a tour of like the absolute hardest hit part of town. And we were walking through a place where there had been significant amounts of abandonment and vacant buildings. And in the midst of this, there were some, like laser cut chicken coops that some architects had put together and beehives. And I was sitting there thinking, wow, this looks really cool. This looks really great. This is really admirable. And this elderly black gentleman walked by, and he just stood there, like literally, with his hands on his hips, looking at us like we were fools. And I said, we got into a conversation with him, and he's like, I moved up here from Georgia so I could shop at the supermarket like everybody else. I don't want to keep bees, and I don't want to keep chickens. I don't want to have to clean up the chicken shit, And that stays with me. It is a perfectly natural instinct to conceive of comfort and respect as being bound up in the things that our society promises us will deliver those things, even independently of the monetization. So this is from the demand side, and then there will always be somebody who's ready to come along and to fulfill that premise and to offer that as a product or a service and to try and monetize those relations. And all I can tell you is that certainly in the mutual aid efforts that I've been associated with, those people would have been shown the door very, very swiftly indeed. I think that it's not clear to me how you would begin to monetize mutual aid. But even recently, like somebody had posted to one of the groups that I'm a part of that that Costco was now selling disaster bundles. They were selling disaster preparedness kits that were like
San Francisco, yeah.
Right. Yeah, you have to have those, but you don't have to have the Costco version that has like the, the extra high-end meals and everything. So somebody will always come along and try and brand.
Convenience has become, so paramount in our culture that people will default to that.
I think that will not last forever, and I think that for reasons I get into in the book, the supply chains that we rely upon for that kind of consumer ease will get truncated fairly shortly, as in fact they were during the pandemic. Whether or not it is a thing of privilege to go and find yourself, in Hudson County somewhere raising chickens, I'm not prepared to judge those people. I think they probably learned something really important, and maybe what they learned was that it wasn't for them, but they will have those skills.
Sure, but you take my point.
I think
they were able to go on that.
Sure.
I wanted to talk about something else. We only have only so many minutes. I've just finished this great essay, and I'll just plug my thing. I work for MIT Technology Review. We're having our 125th anniversary this year, and in the age of magazines, I was like, oh, this is a big deal. But I've just finished editing a wonderful essay for that issue by Lydia Millett, because we had a bunch of people contribute to think about what the world might look like in the next 125 years. And she had this to say about hope. In the realm of emotion, hope guards against despair, whose rationalized intellectual output is cynicism, a free pass out of the tension of grappling with our responsibility to the future, with the difficulty and possible unpleasantness of engagement and resistance. But like cynicism, hope is its own free pass. It functions as a unit of rhetoric, as amorphous as happiness or freedom, a shredded flag in the discourse around climate doomsaying and denial that can only droop over a citadel under relentless siege. If we rely on hope, we give up agency, and that may be seductive, but it's also surrender. You talk about, I love this, because she's basically like, we could just all sit here and hope it's going to be okay, but you know what, it's not. So it's not enough. I think that you sort of share this attitude about hope, and I'm wondering, and you talk about it a lot in your book. I'm wondering if you could speak to.
Yeah. I was raised with this very Harvey Milk notion, right? You know, Harvey Milk was famous for saying, you got to give them hope. You got to give them hope. And we talk a lot about hope as a weapon, you know, hope as an enabling factor, hope as a multiplier of possibilities. I got to tell you, I think hope is killing us. I think all the varieties of hope that I discussed, the investment of psychic energy in things like electoral politics and things like the tepid, more liberal sorts of protest, I think those are displacement activities, and I think those are ways of as Lydia points out, ways of actually avoiding coming to a reckoning with the reality of what's unfolding around us. The book was actually originally called Beyond Hope. You know, we had robust conversations, my editor and publisher, as to whether anybody would buy a book called Beyond Hope. You can see that the answer was in the negative. I continue to think it's a fantastic title, but I think maybe we might have wound up making the right decision in the end. I'm not a fan of hope. I think what I am is a believer in optimism, and this is a really weird and subtle hair to split, but I'm going to try. Optimism is founded for me in empirical study of the things that people have done to protect themselves and their communities. And that is what fills me, because I've seen it. I've seen it myself with my own eyes. I've been around it. I've been lucky enough to draw my own energy from it. I've been lucky enough to draw the energy that, in fact, you know, produced this document of those moments from the things that the people around me were doing. And that fills me not with hope, but in belief for possibility, and that things can still, you know, people have always found their way through hard times, and I think we always will. I just want us to be able to do so with a little bit of dignity, a little bit of orientation, or a greater orientation toward justice, and some verve, you know, and I think that possibility remains open to us. So that's what fills me with optimism.
Fair. Just a couple questions. It seems to me that there's a lot of localism in this book, which totally makes sense. And I think that one thing that emerged during COVID, for good or bad, is that we couldn't rely on global supply chains. And in many ways, this book seems to be, maybe I'm overstating it, maybe not, a little bit anti-globalist. Or I should say pro-local, right? When you rely more on what's in front of you, you treat it differently. Maybe you can speak to that.
Sure. I like to split the difference. It is pro-localist within an internationalist horizon. Like, I'm definitely...
Explain.
Okay, so I make a distinction between globalism and internationalism to start with. Globalism is you know, it's become a pejorative, and I think deservedly so. Globalism refers to the kind of low friction regime of late capitalism in which things are offshored and produced elsewhere, and wages are driven down to their very lowest globally achievable minimum. We are deprived of agency in some really, really meaningful ways. Internationalism is sort of a shibboleth on the left. It refers to an orientation originally towards the working class in every country, So a sense of solidarity with people elsewhere. It's not a xenophobia. It's not localism in the sense of we're going to turn inward on ourselves.
Right.
It's a localism in the sense of we are going to maintain our sense of solidarity with everybody else on the planet who is having to deal with similar conditions. The way in which you achieve that, we do talk about a little bit in the book, and that is through a networked confederalism. But I think I'm going to leave it up to people to discover what I mean by that by reading through it.
Just as an aside, it's very interesting if you've ever heard Zadie Smith talk about her politics. She grew up in a very working class part of England and talks quite, I was just listening to an interview with her today about this, but I've heard it before, that very much espouses this kind of like international solidarity and with like kind of a critique of, you know, if you're a writer and you say you're radical and you're just, that's not enough. You know, like how are you operating at the street level? And yeah, interesting. Check out. In our last couple minutes before questions, we brought this up a little bit earlier.
Do I get a softball now, by the way?
No.
I have no
Ask a journalist interview, and this is what you get. I don't think I've been too
No.
We're going through this interesting moment in the built environment, a few things going on, shift to online shopping, COVID pandemic, slow return to work, all these multiple things leading us to a hell of a lot of vacant space everywhere. We talked about this article about like the millions of square footage of like empty CVS stores in New York City. We have a similar problem with empty Walgreens and all kinds of other empty things here. A lot of these spaces seem to me like really perfect Lifehouse spaces. How much research or thinking have you been doing about zoning and the built environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been doing quite a lot of thinking about this, weirdly enough, in the context of churches, because in the United Kingdom, the profession of Christian faith is in massive retreat. And as a result, there are literally 50,000 church buildings that are vacant in the UK, each one quite physically robust, each one at the psychic and physical heart of its community. And they're, without a congregation, they begin to fall into disrepair, like so many Walgreens on Market Street. There's been quite a lot of angst in the country about, well, what do we do with these spaces? Weirdly enough, after I posted an article about this stuff on the Verso blog, I was approached by the person who heads up the Unitarian Church. They're not responsible for those 50,000 buildings. They're an entirely separate organization. But then, like, the bishop who's actually responsible for the physical plant of the Church of England, who is the person who's responsible for those spaces, both of them wanting to ask, how do we turn these places into Lifehouses?
Amazing.
It's great, except you can't turn a place into a Lifehouse. A community has to make that happen for itself. Like in Occupy Sandy, which I realize I still haven't really described, right? Like after Superstorm Sandy came to fall on New York City in the fall of 2012, the entire city was knocked down to its knees. And, communication networks were down, and transportation networks were down, the power was down. And it was a very, very difficult place to be physically all of a sudden. Within 48 hours, there was an effective disaster recovery, relief, and resilience effort that was set up. It did not come from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It did not come from the National Guard. It did not come from the Red Cross. What it came from, weirdly, is from veterans of Occupy Wall Street the year before, who had these networks between them that were able to call upon those networks really, really rapidly. And weirdly enough, in churches, set up the beginnings of these resilience hubs. So they became warehouses. They became the center of logistical efforts that were designed to bring in all of the goods that were being contributed to people and then send them out to the communities that were hardest hit, the people who needed them most. So it turns out that that was how I got involved in Occupy Sandy. I mean, for the weeks that I was there, I did very little else than move boxes from UPS trucks into the church, down the human chain, into the pews of the church where we had sorted them out. it turns out I have some kind of insight from doing this into how you turn a church into a resilience hub. It cannot happen because the pastor decides, or because their bishop decides, or because some authority decides to make it so. It has to come organically through the need and the desire and the activity of the community that's affected by it. So,
Was that a strict, like if the pastor was at a service of this many people, say, because the congregation is small, and said, I heard about this great idea.
yeah, but it's not their decision. It has to. They can seed the idea in people's hearts, but they can't like by fiat make it happen. And so, for all of those Walgreens, because I've walked by them the same as you have. I have walked through. I am an American. I'm from the United States. I've been living in the UK for the last 10 years. I got to tell you, these last couple of days in Seattle and Los Angeles, and now here, have been really sobering for me. I mean, it's possible that people who live here no longer quite see it in the same way. But you guys over there, if you're interested, there's seats up here in front. You don't have to stand there if you want to sit. It is shocking to see, for me, coming back here now, what's happened to the American cities that I've been walking through, and to the people who experience these places. They would have to first want to turn those spaces into life houses. And if they wanted to, they would find that things have been zoned in such a way as to prevent that from happening. And they would find that, to put it bluntly, capital backed up by the force of the state would not be very likely to allow them to do that. We have not yet arrived at the moment, I think, in which people can leverage the moral authority of the need for that space against the capital value of that space to the market, and literally use a bolt cutter, cut through whatever chains or locks are keeping it from their use, appropriate that space, and make it happen. I'm also acutely aware, I do not want to romanticize what I would think of as naive anarchy. I mean, speaking in Seattle, the bookstore is right there where the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone was, which was an experience of anarchy, which I think for a lot of people was a sharply negative one. It was not a successful inscription of self-organization or self-defense. It was a disaster. And I think that there are moments and places and times and occasions in which people are able to appropriate those spaces and make value out of them and make meaning out of them and make life in them, turn them into life systems. But it's always touch and go, and some places we've not had that experience. So one of the reasons why I'm so interested in telling these stories in the book and hopefully propagating these ideas and hopefully introducing some of them, like most of the audiences that I speak with, even though it's historically recent, even though some of these things happen here, people just don't know these stories. People mostly don't know about Occupy Sandy, let alone the Greek solidarity networks, let alone something like what happened in Rojava. People just don't know these stories. And so the hope is by showing the ways in which people have spontaneously made order, people have spontaneously made the possibility of the sustenance of life, and people have spontaneously made the lineaments, the fundamental foundations of dignity and a dignified and decent existence for people, that anarchy does not have to equal chaos, that anarchy can actually equal that justice, that dignity, that aspirational search for a mode of surviving our times that isn't merely kind of a grim, gritted teeth experience, but is one that offers us some things that our present existence does not offer us. And in that sense is an aperture onto some experiences of life and of the world that people generally right now do not have. Experiences of empowerment, experiences of purpose, experiences of pleasure in one another's empowerment, and that we're all managing to make a go of this thing together.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I want to get to questions. I just want to offer one last example, because I do think that there's room for maybe less of a binary. Like it has to be totally bottom up and there can't be any cooperation. During the recession that I mentioned before, when all this housing was planned in Hayes Valley, not far from here, and there was no money, the city was going to build up hubs through all these vacant lots. And through cooperation, a major urban agriculture organization was able to take over like an acre and farm in Hayes Valley for quite some time. And which is only to say, it was a very bottom-up thing with cooperation from the local government. So they didn't have to cut the votes.
I'm not, this is a really, really subtle thing. Like, I'm not opposed to, there's a place for political parties. There's a place for market actors. There's a place for all of these things. I don't think that we're suddenly going to wake up one morning and live in the world of the dispossessed. Right? My favorite Ursula Le Guin novel, An Ambiguous Utopia, in which an anarchist society has come into being. I think that we always talk of a diversity of tactics, and I want to respect the diversity of life ways that there are in the world. A Lifehouse, if any ever come into existence at all, they will look different in every place that they are. Some of them will have, aspects of market in them. Some of them will be sponsored by states, I'm sure of it. What I talk about in the book is the necessity for all of these things to defend and support one another in a loosely coupled network that observes a couple of basic values that are inscribed from the very beginning. And as long as you have an agreement around those values, you can vary wildly around every other axis. And I think that the thing would cohere.
Do we have any questions?
No questions at all, come on. In the back.
Oh, sorry, way in the back here.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
Yeah, so one of the things I really liked in the book was your experience in Occupy Sanity, because I feel like it's easy to talk about these things, but to actually do them and see how it goes is more revealing maybe. So I'm curious if you could speak to like the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone that you mentioned, and like as somebody who doesn't really know the story, like what exactly went wrong there, and like what are the lessons that we can learn as like maybe a case study?
It's a great question. For those of you who might not have heard the question on the live stream, the question is to talk about what went wrong with the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone and what lessons we might be able to learn from its failure. Do you know, I'm going to disappoint you, I think. I wasn't there. And I like, in this regard, to speak directly to things that I have some experience of and I can speak to. I just don't know enough about what happened in Seattle to be able to say what went wrong. There's a term in complexity science that I come back to a lot, or in chaos theory, and that term is sensitive dependence on initial conditions. And what that means is that, the very first moments of something, beginnings are such delicate times is another way of putting it. At the very first moments of an effort like that, if you don't inscribe these sort of values right off the bat and get some kind of consensus around them, I think you're going to have a hard time trying to impose or come to agreement about those values later on. So I was not there. I don't know what happened at the very beginnings, but I'm tempted to argue that what happened in Seattle, there was not a right off the bat agreement about some very basic things that allowed all kinds of actors to enter that space and to use it for their own ends and to claim the energy of that space for their own purposes. I really, really don't want to speculate beyond that because I don't think it's right for me to do so. But if I can, the lesson that I would learn is that particularly if you are going to appropriate a space, I think you have to be very clear about what the rules are, what the operating agreements are in that space. Joe Freeman famously wrote an essay called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Under conditions of where there are no agreements, where there are no agreed conditions for the discourse or the activity in a place, people will take, and people will make their own, and people who have existing power relations will impose those power relations. So, if there's a kind of anarchist that doesn't believe in rules, and there's a kind of anarchist that does believe in rules and meetings and Rusty's rules of order and these kind of basic agreements as to how to comport ourselves, I'm definitely in the latter camp. And I suspect that's probably what did not happen in Seattle.
Anyone else? You in the front.
I'm curious, when did this become a book that you knew you needed to write?
Wow, what a great question. For those of you on the live stream, when did this become a book that I knew I needed to write? Really, really soon after Occupy Sandy. I had written an article, which in a lot of respects was super naive. And in fact, I almost want to disavow it now. It was, I think it was called something like an operating manual for Occupy Sandy. And the idea was I was taking notes the whole time I was working there, and I wanted to map, I think it was called a diagram of Occupy Sandy. I wanted to map this thing because what I wanted was to do essentially Occupy Sandy in a box. I wanted to make there be an almost literal, like a pelican case with the instructions for how a community can set up a relief hub in a hurry. And what I failed to understand was that you just can't do that. I mean, people have to arrive at some of these determinations for themselves. There's no blueprint. There's no model. What there are people who have done similar things before, and we can attempt to derive valuable lessons from a consideration of their experience. There's no blueprint. There's no map. But what I wanted to do right away was contribute to the propagation of a more permanent mutual aid infrastructure and a more permanent horizontal infrastructure. I thought if we can super effectively take care of a city of tens of millions of people with 60,000 people, why can't we live this way more of the time? Why can't we do more like this in the rest of our lives? And I wanted to help that effort. It was pretty much as soon as I had stopped working in 520 Clinton that it started to happen. But can I ask you a question in return? It's an amazing question. And I'm so curious as to why you would ask that. I don't mean to put you on the spot. We can talk about it later if you want.
I'm just a writer. I'm in a creative writing department, so I'm just always curious about process.
Oh, okay, super. Yeah, there you go.
Yes. I have a question about this, like the ideas that you talk about, and the idea of the Lifehouse, the idea of organizing your neighborhood. It feels really intuitive, like how that could like get together and how it happens. At least for me, it's like less intuitive how that scales across kind of like every neighborhood in every city, in every county, in every state. So I'm curious if you could talk to what are the things, I mean, with Occupy Sandy that enables that across a city the size of New York City or the Greek Solidarity Movement, sounds like across the whole country. Like what are the key things that allow it to scale up from the sort of neighborhood thing that kind of anyone could visualize to something that operates at a larger scale?
That's a great question. So the question is, how do we begin to scale local efforts to the ability to support an entire mega city or country? I'll tell you honestly, the first thing I let go of is the word scale. From before this life, I come from technology. I come from the technology sector, and I think that's the favorite. We're always asking ourselves some version of that question: how do I scale this? How do I scale it up? I've had to learn that what we're interested in, I think, is not scaling but propagating. But almost like cross-pollination between places. What's really interesting in watching some of the extreme right unrest that's been breaking out across the UK, it is now in 30 cities in the UK. And it seems really similar in every place. It is Islamophobic, it is anti-immigrant, it's really violent, it's fascist. I don't think anybody sat there with a master plan thinking about how to scale that. I think what they did was they seeded certain ideas that authorized people who already had those sentiments to act on them. And there was a permission structure that the previous conservative government and certain far-right commentators propagated through social media particularly. I think there's a clue. I think a lot happens through mimesis. I think a lot happens through the creation of permission structures and architectures that allow people to act on, as you say, some of the instincts they have. I think that what we need to get good at is ensuring that those permission structures are the ones that unlock these particular sets of actions and values, and not the ones which are xenophobic and hostile to the other and fascist in their origin. And I think that is going to be a defining question for the next several years. I mean, we get into it a little bit in the book. I don't think that there is any point in defending people against the effects of the storm if we're not also going to protect them against the people who want to do them harm. And that is a challenge for us. But I don't think we can do it by thinking of scalar relations. I think it has to come through some other way of doing things, through stochastic cooperation. If that makes any sense.
Well, on that note, look it up.
I think we have time for one more question.
One very quick question, way in the back.
My question is really, to what degree do you think we can practice or prepare for these prior to the full emergency conditions where these things seem natural for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, to what degree can we prepare now and make ourselves ready for, should the moment befall us? I always say, and I believe, that the most radical thing you can possibly do is learn your neighbors' names. And I think that is the sort of the very beginning of, it's not without risk, it's not without its, vulnerabilities, but it is the beginning of the sorts of networks that we need to rely upon in times of need. There are any skill and capacity and personal development are things that I talk about a lot. What is the worst thing that happens if you learn how to do a little bit of plumbing? What is the very worst thing that happens if you learn how to do a little bit of first aid? What is the very worst thing that happens if you learn any of these sort of material skills that our survival might depend upon? It's never going to be bad to have that capacity and recourse to that capacity. It will never fail you. At worst, there might have been other things that you could have done with that time. But should you be in a situation in which the ability to bind up a wound makes the difference, I think you'll be very glad to have that capacity. And so it's really these almost like scouting-like things, the things that we learned to do when we wore those little uniforms and went off into the woods to start fires and learn how to tie knots. I don't think there's anything wrong with those things, and I think those are going to be actually more critical to the survival of life ways of dignity and justice than we might have any idea right now.
Have you read the novel Severance?
I have not.
You
Which
must. Severance? Not the TV show, the novel by Ling Ma, very prescient pandemic novel, and which you now read because the first paragraph is basically like, this mass event has happened, and all we know how to do is like turn our computer on. And then proceeds like what happens. I would highly recommend that to anyone in the audience. Thank you so much, Adam, and thanks to Green Apple and to everyone in the audience for coming. I'm sure Adam will be around to chat.
Indeed, and to sign some books if you're interested in having me ruin your brand new copy of Lifehouse. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Green Apple. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. It's been wonderful to be here, and I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity to discuss these ideas with you. I hope you have a great night.
Can we give one more hand for Adam and Allison, please? Thank you both so much. Thank you for coming all the way from London to spend time with us. And Allison, thank you for your close reading and your great questions. Thank you all for your attention and great questions as well. I'll be brief. I'm just here to say that we have copies of Lifehouse at the front register. You can find them there. I'm going to have Adam signing at the back desk where there's a little stand with a copy of the book. If you need to know where to go, I will gladly tell you. And if not, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Yay!
I look at this. What's going on here? Maybe it's a prank show.
No, it's super fun. I enjoy being Yes. Oh, go. I did want to ask you.